Hello and welcome to the second edition of the Geographical Quartet, das Geographische Quartett, here at the Botanical Gardens of the University of Bonn. My name is Julian Wagenknecht, my pronouns are they, them, and I'm a student here at the university, but mainly I'm an activist. I'm here today with Daniel Tsegai, Melanie Brunn, and Gesche Schifferdecker. We're here to discuss global crises, how they are intertwined, and mainly drought, desertification and possible solutions to those problems, which would be ecological restoration and how to work with nature instead of being apart from it. I don't need to tell anyone that the climate crisis is already here. We all feel the consequences. The massive negative effects can be felt all around the world, mainly in the global south, for the people who are least responsible for all these problems. The Botanical Garden is a symbol of the exact mindset that got us to this place. A symbol for the idea that we can subdue nature and make it our servant. But today we want to look at another perspective on that, because maybe nature is the solution to everything.
Hi, I'm Gesche Schifferdecker. I'm a communications manager at the Bonn office of European Forest Institute. We do research on forests, on ecosystem services, on forest policy, on biodiversity, and I'm a political scientist by background. I'm looking forward to exchanging with you tonight.
My name is Melanie. I'm currently holding a visitor professorship position at the University of Koblenz. I'm a geographer by training, but have a strong focus on geoecology. So my main focus is on investigating biogeochemical cycling and how they feed back to the climate system.
From my side, my name is Daniel Tsegai. I'm a program officer at the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification is one of the 3 Rio conventions that you probably may know of. As Julian said, droughts are now becoming more and more intense. In terms of frequency, they are becoming also harder and faster. So we always say that drought is not a crisis, it is a risk. We need to come up with a policy of the principle of risk reduction. And I'm very excited to be here today with you in this quite interesting setting and to discuss this issue of drought, global crisis and ecosystem restoration. Looking forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these insightful introductions. I think we can start with maybe a short statement on a central thing you have learned during your research about these crises.
Well, I'm not a researcher, I'm a communications person, but of course I've been working on these topics for more than 6 years now, and I've learned one central thing, that is we have to, and that's also what Melanie was saying, we need to overcome the silos. In the case of forests, it's very often the forest manager on the one side and the nature protection stakeholders on the other side, and very often they have the same goals, but they struggle to communicate with each other because they speak different languages. And I think to really tackle the major challenges, like with regards to the forest, but with regards to ecosystem in general, we need to overcome those silos. And I think communication and sitting together plays a major part in that. So that's something that I've learned, that communication matters, and I'm not just saying that because I'm a comms person, but because it really makes a difference.
If I may add on that silo approach, I think we always keep saying drought is not a sector, it is a connector. When drought strikes, it impacts every segment of the economy. But when you go to any country, when you talk about drought, it is about one sector, one ministry talking about drought issues. But when drought strikes, it becomes a national disaster. So what we are trying to promote is, let's try to look into a comprehensive approach on how to manage drought. Finance should be involved, health should be involved, Ministry of Meteorology, Water, Agriculture, Environment, everyone should come up. I think what you said is very important. This silo approach is not going to be working well in future. I think a whole society or economy approach. And what we are trying to do is now allow communication. You need to have a national drought mitigation strategy. That means involving every stakeholder when it comes to the planning of preparedness for drought. And one thing that I would also want to, if Julian would not allow me to speak anymore, one thing that I would want to say is that drought, we need to be more prepared for drought. This is always the case that countries are waiting and it becomes too little and too late and it becomes a disaster. So preparedness is very important, and communication among the various sectors and policymakers is also important. I just wanted to add into that communication aspect. Yeah.
That's what you said. Not treating it like a crisis you have to react to, but a
risk
you have to prepare for.
Yeah.
Because it is real.
It is real.
Obviously, yeah.
It is coming harder and faster. Means usually we had droughts like on average globally between 5 to 7 years on every country. Now it's coming like every other year. For East and the Horn of Africa, it's coming like every year. We are hoping this time there will probably be less drought, but I think it is coming, and it is coming. So we need to have a policy. We need to be prepared for it. So that's what we mean by the proactive approach to drought management, which means you have a policy, you know the command chain, who is going to do what. If you are going to wait for drought to strike, then it becomes too late, and it's also expensive, by the way, because it's uncoordinated. You have to come up with emergency relief operations, and that means it's uncoordinated, ineffective.
I'm just wondering, because I work with ecosystems, how can we be prepared, or how can we prepare this? I think you are talking about preparing the society and all these structures around that, because ecosystems cannot really prepared for drought, or do you have examples for that?
Yes. When it comes to preparedness, it's about completing the cycle. Completing the cycle means when usually the business as usual approach is to wait for drought to strike and you do some emergency and relief operations. But you have to be prepared, which means there are 3 pillars for preparedness. One is early warning and monitoring systems, that everyone is aware about when drought is going to strike, how it is going to affect their crop production, for example, and their day-to-day activities. That's one. The other thing is also to be able to have a drought risk profiling, mapping of the areas in your country who is going to be vulnerable, because not every segment and every part of the country is going to be vulnerable, and also the amount of rainfall that the part of the countries receive is also different for different countries. So what we are trying to help countries is to be able to have a mapping of their drought risk profile. The other thing is to come up with drought risk mitigation measures. No one size fits all. What are your comparative advantages? What do you have at hand? Sometimes before drought strikes, there is a lot of rain, and that is a lot of flood. So how can they harvest the flood? Water harvesting, or if they could introduce drought-tolerant crops. So we have a drought toolbox where we try to support countries based on context-specific solutions. By doing this, they are prepared. It doesn't mean that it will not strike, it will not affect them, but the impacts will be reduced. As far as the UNCCD is concerned, our niche is to minimize the impact. But I think we have to learn how to live with a drought situation. This is going to be the reality. But if we are prepared, I think we can mitigate the impacts.
I think Melanie was also referring to managing the ecosystem or supporting the ecosystem in becoming more resilient to drought, right?
Exactly.
So it was not just about kind of how to prepare the chain of command in a way, but also to help the ecosystem to become more resilient to drought.
Yeah, maybe it's a way to address several structures, or to manage it through several ways. Because just from the perspective of an ecosystem, I really see that just ecosystems have really the capacity to adapt to drought, even after a short period of drought. But this is not the case maybe with I'm talking about temperate ecosystems, which were not so don't have these severe droughts as in other parts of the world, maybe. Because relating to how the nature responds, I'm often surprised how good they regulate drought. Because there's not only the positive feedback to the climate system, ecosystems can also respond in that they induce negative feedback and that they store, for example, more carbon in soil, even or exactly under drought situations.
So you mean positive reinforcing the crisis,
yes,
and negative taking
yes,
away from the crisis?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. But you also talked about, I think all of you did, about like these isolated approaches, like one segment does this and one does this, and you speak on a national level for drought. But what about an international level? Because droughts are happening everywhere. Like in Germany we have also now one every year, and the soil is degrading and it's spreading. And of course we need national approaches because we have nations. But what do you think about international approaches?
It's good that you ask this question because it's now becoming dominating the international negotiations on drought. We had conference of parties in China in 2017 and another one in India in 2019, and the latest one was in Cote d'Ivoire in 2022. All these three consecutive conferences of parties were dominated by the agenda of how to sustainably manage drought under the UNCCD globally. You are right, it's coming, it's national, but it's also a global issue. The drought that strikes Germany will also definitely affect Netherlands and neighboring countries. When you talk about drought in Kenya, it's also about Somalia, Ethiopia, so drought knows no political boundaries. Now, countries are discussing this in a very serious manner. They established an intergovernmental working group on drought, representing 3 representatives from each region, Africa, Asia, Europe, and international experts. And it's too early to say what they are going to come about, but they are talking between if we should have a legal binding agreement on drought. Should we talk about a financing, how can we finance drought, like innovative financing for drought mechanisms, like how can we support countries? If they know what to do, but at least supporting them in order to that money flows, resources flow, to help them to prepare for drought. The other thing that they are looking into is the global target on drought. Like climate change, for example, everybody knows. We want to have a 1.5 degrees in 2030. Easy to understand, to communicate. And also on drought, we want to be a drought resilient world. By when? And what does it mean? So they are also looking into that option. So the international policy instruments are the basic discussions now dominating the agenda on our conference of parties. And there are a lot of options on the table, but it is yet to be discussed and to be probably, hopefully, decided by the next conference of parties in December 2024 in Saudi Arabia.
And what will happen when it's decided? Because I think very often those mechanisms are then top-down mechanisms, and I wonder, and it's the same applies to any ecosystem restoration initiative, for instance, that very often the local people are either not aware, which is not the worst thing, which is already bad, but even worse is they are not involved in the process, but they are the ones who need to maintain the procedures or need to support the procedures. So I wonder, like, what about bottom-up approaches? And maybe you can tell more about that, Julian, because as a political scientist, I'm so often disappointed and really angry about what is happening. And of course, I very much appreciate the work of the UN, and it's great that we have it, but I wonder how effective the measures are in the end, and what is also just empty promises. So maybe you can both respond to that.
I can say a few words, and then maybe Julian. On that, I think for the Intergovernmental Working Group, there are representatives of civil society organizations.
Okay, that's already good.
They represent the needs of the indigenous community, that's one. The other thing is this Intergovernmental Working Group, the representatives of the countries are also expected to consult with every segment of the country, the national level and the sub-regional level, so that they come up with the needs, with the challenge, what they are looking into, and they also come and discuss with them what are the options. So we have representatives, and the representation has to be definitely reflected in the discussion. So of course there is every attempt made that it should not be a top-down approach, because in the end it will not be effective.
No, and not sustainable.
And we need, participation is ownership, so that if they will own this, at the end of the day, I think we need to make sure that they are participants of this discussion. So there is an attempt made. If it is enough or not, it's another question. But Julian can help us maybe how to.
I'm actually glad you brought that up, because as a part of Extinction Rebellion, that is a grassroots movement. So it's the whole approach is bottom to up, bottom to top, and not top down. Because I think, as we've seen with the Paris Agreement, there's a lot of talk and there's a lot of good talk as well. But what happens on a national level, the countries pledge, but they don't deliver. And even the pledges are not enough. If the current pledges by every country, by every nation on Earth is realized, as they said, we will still head to a warming of around 3 degrees. And it's double like what they want, like 1.5 degrees. And so if the pledges aren't enough and they don't even deliver on that, like Germany failed again this year. And a lot of nations also do that, especially the ones most responsible. So I think it's a good approach to maybe rethink that. But you said the UNCCD has actually binding measures.
Binding
So
agreement.
that's different from, like, for example, the Paris Agreement. And what's the difference to the other RIA conventions, the UNCCD and the CBD?
They are all binding agreements.
They're all binding agreements.
But the Paris Agreement is another agreement.
Yeah, that's
of course.
another agreement. Yeah.
Exactly. But in terms of the UNCCD, it's a binding agreement by itself. But I think it's a very good point about reading the profile, making sure that the civil society, we have youth groups, for example, also, who are advocating activities like you, making sure that I was very impressed by a young guy who was in the panel with me who said, nothing for us without us, which means the youth should be part of the discussion, because what we decide now is going to affect them in the future generation. So I think it's important that we need to be very, very inclusive. And the other thing is also trying to appreciate the indigenous community. When you go from country to country, how they mitigate the impacts of drought. We talk about early warning, the technology. In Nigeria, in the remote areas, I was very impressed how they can really forecast drought by some indigenous with the stars, whatever they were telling me, and they are perfectly consistently able to predict the drought. So I think this kind of long experience, having this kind of indigenous knowledge should be somehow integrated into what we are doing. I don't know what the audience would say about this, but it's very important that we need to have to be inclusive. That's inclusivity.
I completely agree on that, because indigenous communities have lived with nature for like all of their history, and that's completely different life from what we do, and we ruined it. Global North ruined it basically for everyone else, and now they have to suffer the main impact. And I even think indigenous communities protect most of the world's biodiversity. They're clearly doing something right. And what can we learn from indigenous communities? So how can we integrate that knowledge into what we do today? Like what I said at the beginning, the Botanical Garden is something like, oh, look at nature. This is what we plant and we can grow that, and nature adheres to what we say. But I think
the colonist point of view.
Yes, it's the colonist point of view. That's how all this develops, colonialism, capitalism, and that scales. We cannot work with the same system that ruined us. And that's what I'm trying to do. We're doing civil disobedience because I, for my part, realize that what the governments are doing is not working. So we need a civil approach, like the people have to decide what to do, and especially in countries where more indigenous communities live, they have to have a say, like a meaningful say. They know better than me. And I think a lot of politicians should listen to them. Politics doesn't do that. Politics listens to themselves and money. So how can we change that?
Yeah, but integrating indigenous knowledge is very hard. We don't have any statistics. For example, I have a current project where I try to make research more diverse, also which allow at the end to integrate also indigenous knowledge. But we are even, the only statistics we have are related to gender, and even there we really fail in being equal in gender.
So how would you go about?
I don't know, maybe we need statistics for that, or maybe we should, I don't know. Actually, I have no solution how to do that. But yeah, I think if we are all aware of integrating or promoting a greater diversity of knowledge, because people from different cultures bring different knowledges with in the community. So I think if we promote that, this could be a way forward to also creating more diverse solutions, because as you said, what we tried at the moment is not really successful, or the problems are more diverse in the future. So we really need more diverse solution as well.
So the problem is from the science, from the side of analysis, is it the problem from the indigenous community that they were not able to communicate how they have dealt with this problem for centuries? Where do you see the problem? Because if it is a problem of analysis, I think that is our problem, in my view. We need to change the narrative, because at the end of the day, the solution is for them. And as I said, nothing for them without them. And we need to really make sure that there is bottom up, but top down. I don't believe strongly in the bottom up, but also not top down, but I think we need an optimal mix of it, because we need to listen to them. Listening is part of it. And once they are heard, what we do at the UNCCD is we have about 400 accredited organizations, civil society organizations, who come to the conference of parties, representatives of these civil society organizations. They discuss the issues, they make an intervention on every agenda point. So I think at the end of the day, there is some kind of a decision where it reflects their interests. It doesn't mean that everything what they said is heard and it's written, but at least making sure that they know what is happening and there is a reflection, and they discuss, they negotiate. But at the end of the day, of course, there should be a kind of a negotiated outcome of the decision, and it reflects their interest. The fact that we hear their voice is already one thing, because we tell it's a solution, and then there is a problem, and if we are going to address that problem, we need to hear from those who are close to the problem. I don't live in a situation of drought, for example, now. Where I grew up, where I come from, originally from Eritrea, I know firsthand what drought looks like and how it affects the day-to-day life. And if you bring this representative of a farmers association or water users association, come into this conference of parties discussing the issues, how it is affecting them. You couldn't believe it, the stories that they tell. And it becomes more than political, more emotional, and it's a real life problem, and people start to really discuss these issues that are affecting daily lives of people. I mean, it is tragic how people live under drought conditions in Africa especially.
Yeah, I think in Somalia.
Somalia is another good example.
At the moment there's like the 5th season where it didn't rain.
Exactly.
And millions of people are facing starvation. And a lot of other different problems.
And what makes it tragic is drought should not necessarily lead to famine, because there is an ample opportunities to make an intervention to break that cycle, because it's a slow onset phenomenon. It's not like flood, it just swaps you in a matter of seconds. But drought is a slowly creeping phenomenon, and that makes it a bit tragic that policymakers are too slow. They just, sometimes we say, it is it's less visible, and because of that, it's really difficult also for policymakers to give it a priority.
Do you think they don't know, or do they not care?
I was in Stockholm last month, where we always kept complaining that droughts are not given political prioritization because the government leaders worry about the next election. But now droughts are coming faster than the election cycle, so they are now being worried too much about also drought. So it's, when you compare it to earthquake, to tsunamis, to floods, to everything else, I think drought is less visible. But it is the most deadly disaster when it comes to the economic cost, the human lives and livelihoods that it is costing. It is one of the first ranked hazards in terms of its impact, but it's slow onset, less visible, easy to ignore in a way or to neglect. So
until it becomes too bad.
Exactly, and then it becomes too late to address the impacts.
But do you think, because we had maybe starting in 2003 and then was continued in 2018, 22 was a severe drought here in Europe as well. Do you think this makes a difference? Because then we really feel what drought means.
The kind of the frequency.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I used to think that it helps when people see the effects of what they're doing. Like 2 years ago we had severe flooding in a part of this country. And like in my home region as well, I'm not from Bonn, but from a different part of Germany near Luxembourg, and a part of our town also flooded. And actually one of my family members died, not directly but indirectly caused by that. And I used to think people see the destruction and they feel losses in their own families.
Still don't change their habits.
No,
yeah.
They don't change. And now it seems like it's forgotten. Now people who are from that region, the Ahrtal, I see them on the street when I'm doing something like a protest, and they scream at me for disrupting their day for like 3 minutes. Like we have a format where we do a legal protest that's like 3 to 4 minutes of blocking the road, and then we're gone again, and then we're on again. But they can continue their day, but still they scream at us because their day is disrupted, and I understand that it's annoying. But I kind of try not to give up on people because of that. But sometimes I wonder, how can we communicate differently? Because you're also the head of communications at the European Forest Institute, right?
At the Bonn office, yeah.
What exactly are you doing to, like you're a communications expert, like I really wonder.
Yes, it is actually, it's a big challenge. Yeah. I completely agree. And I think particularly also when it comes to science communications, because scientists have been talking about climate change, talking about the effects of climate change since 30 years. Yeah. And in the case of forests, the same applies. Certain things were already clear 30 years ago. And actually a lot of foresters changed tried to adapt the forest. So it was not that they all planted spruce. I mean, this is an ecosystem that takes a very long time to grow. The scientists were warning, and a lot of people were not impressed, particularly policymakers, but also the also society. One problem is that people don't like to be taught. People don't like this. And on the other hand, what is the alternative? Because we're really screwed, right? So but people don't want to listen to this narrative that we're screwed. And it makes sense because people need hope.
So how would you change the narrative?
I don't have the one-fits-it-all solution, of course. You need to think about the audience, and they're different audience and they have different needs. So what we try to do in our communication, we think about where the audience is standing, and we try to go there and try to address their everyday needs and their challenges with our narrative. So we try to find integrative narratives. However, these narratives need to contain convincing facts. So those facts are, of course, need to be science-based. Convincing facts that affect the people. They need to evoke their emotions, but not in a bad way, in a way that they kind of feel threatened, or that they feel embarrassed, which is actually something people like that doesn't make people change their mind. So we need to find, and I've recently listened to a podcast that really convinced me. It was about what would we need to do to really stick to the 1.5 degrees, and what would need to be done in Germany, like in very concrete terms. And yes, we will need to live a very different life, but the life is not a bad life. It is actually a life where we will probably not be able to fly anymore. Yes, this will affect us all. It would but we can still take the train and go somewhere. We would still be able to go on vacation. We would still have heating for our houses because we also have amazing technology. Technology won't save us. I mean, of course, we need to reduce heavily, but the narrative was really positive. The life she was envisioning was really like also calmer. It would be less stress because we wouldn't struggle. We would have less money, but we would also need less, and we would live more like organic, more local, etc. So it was not a utopia, but it was not a dystopia either. So to kind of be really concrete about what people can change, to make them part of the movement. Also, very often I'm just completely devastated. And then I also want to scream at people and like, how can you live this way? But I also, of course, need to reflect upon my own way of living. It's not a solution, but it's one approach, one idea that we're trying to do is to find those inclusive narratives that show concrete examples what can be done, and then also make the people part of the solution. And you will still have a lot of people who don't listen, but maybe it's also a step-by-step approach. I mean, people don't change their mindsets from one day to the other, but those stories, those inclusive stories, like those examples, I think they make an impact. That's at least what we experience when it comes to the forest ecosystem restoration activities.
That's actually very similar to the approach we're trying to communicate, but I think we as Extinction Rebellion, for example, I'm also part of other rights movements, but have difficulty getting that across. Like people think we want to annoy them, or
they feel offended.
They feel offended, yes, but we grew up in the same system. Like I grew up with all the things people know and do today, but that's the system that makes us sick. Like it makes the planet sick, and it makes us sick, and we're really trying to communicate like a better world we can live in. That's still a good world. Like we don't need infinite growth.
No,
but how can we shift that narrative? Like
we need to find narratives for degrowth and show all the advantages of it.
I don't have to talk. You can
talk. You're talking to the converted, so I mean that's probably preaching to the converted. It applies to everyone in this room, but it's really crucial to find those kind of good examples of the life that people could live.
And how would you go about, like you said you had really problems like having statistical knowledge about, for example, indigenous communities and communicating so they can be integrated. And how would you go about integrating different types of communities that already feel really underrepresented in the national way and in an international way? Like global North and like G20 governments really dominate global policies. So how can we change that?
Of course, I think it's coming up now with Ethiopia, for example, is in the G20, and also a few other countries. It is coming, but I just wanted to go back to what you were saying about how to change the narrative. I'm a strong believer of a slow change where we need to educate. We need to go beyond awareness raising, start educating small children about climate, about drought, about the global crisis, the way of living. I think this is very important because we always look into a very shortcut, trying to activate, and then people are annoyed simply because it's not part of the curriculum. So I think it's very important that we need to start from scratch. And I keep always saying from a tool set to mindset. We know the technology, we know we can do many things, but the mindset, changing the mindset is one of the hardest things that you can do.
Most difficult.
That's why we need to start from changing even the curriculum. We talk about mathematics, English, chemistry, physics, but what about all these real life issues? And then it's very important for them. Then they will get to know how it's going to affect them. And it will not be exceptional activities like you young people who grew up in this situation, but they are a lot of them who are as young as you and they don't care about the climate probably.
But it's on the other hand, then it's like we're putting the responsibility on their shoulders and they're the ones. Like, I mean, I'm also not yet old, but I am thinking about my kids, and of course I need to educate them, but they can solve the problems for us, because if we wait until they solve the problems, then we're all screwed. So it's also our responsibility. I think of course education is key, but also we have everyone has a responsibility, right? It can't be the responsibility of the young people.
I also completely agree. I think we should definitely change a lot about our current curricula. I think slow change, I think we're beyond that, to be honest. I think we need those things, definitely. I wish I would have known about all that stuff that was going on, but and I think I started doing activist stuff when I was 16, and that was like 5 years ago. So a lot of people, yes, they don't know what's going on, but also a lot of people do, but they still don't change. Sorry for the personal story, but my father always says, like, change takes time, and you have to, it's coming. People are eating less meat, driving less cars, flying less, but that is simply not enough. And that is my entire point. Like, we need those changes, but we can't stop there. We can't do either or. We need to do we need to do that, and need fast policy changes. And I think, like you said, we have known about all this for at least the past 30 years. Like, the greenhouse effect was known in the 19th century, I think. So it has been obvious. So what do we do with that now that we have wasted all the time? And it wasn't us that wasted that time. Like, we didn't waste that time. It was people before us. So how can we deal with that now so that the people coming after us don't have to be in an even worse situation? I think about all the anxiety I have about that, and I'm not living in a bad place. What about the people that come after us? And the people that feel the consequences now? The crisis is here. I saw an article by a UN news thing that said, like, 10 climate records broken in July and August 2023, and 6 of 9 planetary boundaries crossed, and a lot of other things. That's really bad. So how can we prevent that from happening to people now and in the future? Yeah, and you work on a global policy level and on a national policy level. So you know what happens with governments, and you do the
How do you manage not to lose hope, Daniel?
That's a good question, actually.
Look, it's not easy, especially when it comes to international agreements, because countries have different interests. About 196 countries plus the European Union, 197 parties coming together to discuss one issue like the drought.
Yes.
The way it is affecting drought in different countries is also different. If you go to Zimbabwe, where they have to even auction their wildlife, about 10,000 elephants were just auctioned simply because of drought, and how it affects others, like girls who couldn't go to school simply because of the water. They had to fetch water, or the hygiene issues. So it is, if you go to a very developed country, drought is maybe affecting them only because they had to wash their cars like every other week or whatever.
Can't put water into the swimming
or
pools.
the garden, whatever, something like that. So when they discuss, you see that difference. To bring them into one, and then this is a real life, day-to-day life effect. I think that's not an easy issue, and I wouldn't expect any quick fix on this. But we should definitely not lose hope, because we have come this far, and countries are now really discussing it year after year. And I'm telling you, I'm at the focal point of this intergovernmental working group, where we have civil society, we have NGOs, we have UN agencies, we have countries from all over the world, and also representatives. And it's a serious issue. And what I discussed was they are looking into legally binding agreement, non-legally binding agreement, financing instruments, and some kind of a global target on drought. So there are a lot of options that they are looking into. I can guarantee you, I don't think there is any quick fix or solution, but it is coming. Why? Because it's becoming a day-to-day reality. Government representative of Germany was in our COP, where he says, Before 6-7 years, you guys sit here in Bonn, we were not really, we didn't really see this desertification, land degradation, drought, but now we see it in our own eyes, we are part of it, we want to work with you. So I think if you feel it, you know it firsthand, and it's not about somebody's problem, it's your problem. And UNCCD is now a global convention that is attracting the parties' interest, and it's gaining momentum, I would say. And if we expect some kind of a quick, short, and fixed solution, then I think it will not happen. But the solution that is going to come is long-lasting, and it's going to have an impact. And we should keep making sure that there is some kind of progress, albeit it is slow, but there is progress towards the right direction. So we need activists like you.
Yes, very much so.
Very much so.
I would like to still also talk about ecosystem restoration, because there was one of the topics today,
Yes,
and I think it's
definitely.
a topic that also has a little bit more hope.
Yes,
and we need the hope. We need the hope, so maybe we can
pursued.
talk a little bit about that as well.
Oh, I
because
was
that's-
just about to ask a very loaded question, so maybe we can talk about that before. Because you work with biodiversity and also invasive species and things like that. Can you tell us a bit about the connections between what we discussed before and like restoration?
Also what I
and
had in
things?
mind is that we have hope in the ecosystems,
Yeah.
because they will survive, because they will
They
find...
will also survive us.
Yeah,
I mean,
this is something I don't know. Yeah, this is true, because they find ways to adapt to whatever they are exposed to, and they find a new stable state where they survive. I always find it very impressive that ecosystems respond to, for example, drought. I work in a drought experiment where we simulate drought in a temperate forest, in a temperate mature forest.
You mean like a forest that's like around us?
The forests as we have here around Bonn, for example, there are roofs built below the canopy which were closed for 5 consecutive years to simulate drought. As I'm also a soil scientist, and I don't know if you work a lot with soils, because
soil is amazing.
yeah, but everything that is taking place there is very, very hidden, and we need new techniques to really see what is happening there. So most research around how ecosystems respond to drought is happening above ground. So we measure, for example, that whenever ecosystems experience drought, the plants reduce their photosynthesis. They take up less carbon dioxide. And at the end we say, okay, the ecosystems lose their sink function for carbon. However, when we integrate soil, we see that soils respond totally different to that. They accumulate carbon when they experience drought, and especially roots are a very important component of that. So I think we really need to take everything which is in the ecosystem into account to really understand how drought or any other global change impacts our ecosystem. Invasive species is the other part. Here I investigate biogeochemical cycling, or how invasive species affect the nitrogen cycle, because we know invasive species compete with the native species for resources, nutrients, water as well. And we work with an invasive species that is widely spread across Europe and North America, Fallopia japonica, the Japanese knotweed. And for that...
Is that an animal or a plant? Sorry, I have no
it's
idea.
a plant, sorry. It's kind of a bush. It's growing along riparian areas, and when you ever have seen a picture of it, you will find it everywhere. So it's spreading very fastly, and it strongly affects the nitrogen cycle. And maybe all of you are aware of that we have too high nitrate loads in our drinking water. And interestingly, what this invasive species is doing, it inhibits the nitrification, so the production of nitrate. So now we can, there's, as I said at the beginning, we have these positive feedbacks to whatever ecosystems are exposed to, drought or temperature or invasive species as itself, but we also have it as a loop, so there is always a negative feedback.
Do you think laws like the nature restoration law that is proposed by the EU, that to restore like 20% of nature by 2030, do you think that's a good policy? Does it work? Could it work?
It depends on the ways that are used for that, because a lot of projects are based on planting trees. And from the soil perspective, it's not always a good way to do that, because if we plant trees on agricultural sites, this is good because agricultural soils are depleted in carbon. But if most of the trees are planted on grasslands, and the first response of this grassland soils is that they release huge amounts of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So
that's counterproductive.
And it's also, of course, very much about, like, the focus is very much on planting trees. I think the nature restoration law is actually, because I studied it a little bit as part of a project on ecosystem restoration, and it is broader. Unfortunately, the agricultural lobby was really kind of heavily protesting against it, so we don't know how.
Of course they did.
Surprise, surprise. But so we don't actually know how much the agricultural land, which would be really important to be protected or to be restored, will maybe be excluded, or at least partly. But when it comes to the forest, it's also very much about what you plant, and not to just restore or plant anything, but to consider the entire ecosystem, consider the soil condition, consider climate change. And so we have in this one project about ecosystem restoration, where we have different demonstration sites all over Europe, we have this called Prestoration approach, which also tries to integrate the climatic changes that we will be expecting. And very often certain tree species won't have a future in a certain region, so you need to kind of select the right tree species. We have a lot of soil experiments also in that project, because very often also even the foresters, also the forest scientists, they don't consider the soil enough. And that's a big problem, because
how come?
They see the forest is the tree.
They see everything
and it stops
which is
at
above,
the root.
yeah, which is above ground, but not what is below ground. It's
roots are included,
yeah.
Maybe.
Sometimes,
this is really a point I discussed very often. And this is the language we need to adapt. I realize that when the forest ecophysiologist talks about forest, it's the tree stopping at the root. The soil is not included.
But you were also talking about biodiversity, and I think you were also asking Melanie about biodiversity, and I think that's a crucial point when it comes to ecosystem restoration, also when it comes to the nature restoration law, when it comes to the biodiversity strategy, the EU biodiversity strategy. What is very often, I think, and that's also a problem of communication, is like restoring biodiversity is like we do something good for the nature, which is complete bullshit, because we're actually protecting our own ass. Because without biodiversity, I mean, as you said, the ecosystem, it will recover eventually. Also, the forest will recover.
But we won't.
But we won't. So I think that's actually should be part of the narrative, that this is not something we do for the nature, like out of goodwill, because we are so kind people, but because this is about the continuation of the species, the human species on Earth.
But the problem is we are living the real world. Policymakers, how do we convince the policymakers? I was about to interject on that. You know, there is an economic value on this ecosystem restoration. Yeah. I was reading the IPCC assessment report where they say about 6:1 cost-benefit ratio. I think when we talk to policymakers, they are policymakers, how can we sensitize them?
Yeah, we need
to
use
make
their
a
language,
decision?
of course.
And restoring land, sequestering carbon underground, you know, the greenhouse gas emission, about 25% of it can be sequestered underground. By doing that, you are also increasing the productivity of land. You can grow more crops. So it's a win-win approach. So we always say the land is an operative link. Somebody was asking the link between biodiversity, climate change, and our convention it's land. So it's good that you talk about land. It makes real economic sense also to invest on your land. First of all, it has 6:1 cost-benefit ratio, but also it's contributing to climate change mitigation and impact. So this is our narrative. It's not only about making this green, and then we are talking about restoration, but also contributing to climate change mitigation. So it's a win-win approach.
Yeah, and our approach is we're actually trying Extinction Rebellion. That's why I joined Extinction Rebellion, is not only because of the book we're talking about in a bit, I think, but because it not only addresses climate change, like the climate crisis catastrophe, but also the crisis of biodiversity. Like recently, like 2 to 3 weeks ago, there was the IPBES in Bonn, like the IPCC, but for biodiversity, and we did 2 bigger protests here and a few other things, and people don't know about that panel. They don't. They know the IPCC,
but they don't
maybe,
know this, yes.
but they don't know the other one. And they see climate change, they see climate crisis, and they usually people know about that by now. But they don't know that biodiversity is. We may have declared a climate emergency, and that's good. That's really good. But we also need like a biodiversity emergency.
Yeah.
And what I wanted to ask you. And you, I think, because the law, the nature restoration law, sounds good, but what about an ecocide law? Like criminalize ruining nature. Do you think that could work? I think we need that. Like companies that knowingly destroy huge amounts of land and life.
Where the problem is actually monitoring ecosystem process or the ecosystem itself. So commodifying ecosystems is really a problem. And kind of the protection of ecosystems is based on that we give ecosystems values. And this is also part of the problem, maybe, because we have to argue that this specific ecosystem, for example, has a specific value, and I don't really agree on that. Also, the win-win situation, I don't know. This is also hard to evaluate because sometimes, yeah, we know that carbon and soil, for example, is good because there is more nutrients in that, and water can be stored at higher rates. It's kind of a problem, but then we have companies that sell, for example, this carbon certificates, which are then again the next problem because some farmers just do what they are told and they don't act in their own responsibility.
I wanted to ask anyway, because it always I've always wondered, like if you want to fly somewhere, like use a plane, then you can compensate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Does that actually work, or is it just another capitalist strategy to make you feel better?
Probably
because they
better
mainly plant trees,
they
and
maybe plant trees, and if it depends, of course, on the organization they are supporting. It's better than nothing, but it's not enough. Yeah. I would say, and I would.
Okay.
I mean, and I agree with the. I mean, it's also, of course, something that is discussed in the field of, in the field of forests. This kind of payment for ecosystem services, because forest owners would happily set aside more forests and kind of protect them for biodiversity conservation, but they also need income. So it's not that they enjoy harvesting a lot, and many actually don't harvest a lot and have biodiversity conservation in mind and protect the like microhabitats and the dead wood in the forest. But even if they do that, they need to sell wood because it's their revenue. So, and many would actually like to set more forests aside, which would also mean that we would need to reduce our consumption when it comes to wood, but that's another question. So the payment for ecosystem services are difficult, but I think they need to come because we unfortunately live in a capitalist system, and I would be completely in for changing that, but it will take a while. So we need to monitorize these things.
Actually, another question I had. Do you think in this system, because you work in the system with the governments and the companies, and you talking about monetization and speaking their language, communication, do you think we can achieve the necessary change we need to avoid like catastrophic warming within this system? Do you think that's possible?
I'm very optimistic. Also,
I'm not.
Yeah, because I disagree as well.
We have about 130 countries now who have voluntarily set land degradation neutrality, for example, setting program. By 2030, they want to become a land degradation neutral country. 130 countries. This is
what are the sanctions? Reason. I mean, what will happen if they don't?
You know,
which relates to the kind of potential law.
No one forces them to do. It is a voluntary. And the fact that they came up with this is already a reason of hope. 70 countries have now a national drought plan based on principle of risk reduction. So there is a lot coming up with the countries. I think the awareness raising, everything is there. The instruments are missing. That's why I think we did not mention about the private sector, for example. How can we make the investment case for ecosystem restoration? The UNCCD, for example, we talk about an LDM fund, land degradation neutrality fund. The private sector is now being involved because in order to make it sustainable, it cannot be done only by the public. So how can we take the initiative? There is a successful case of this private sector involvement on land degradation and also investing on this, trying to really make the investment case for climate resilience. I think that is the future. How can we, it's a challenge, but it's coming up so that we make the business case, and because it will have a profit, and I think the private sector will be involved with more business leaders will come up. And so there is a lot to be played by government, by international development partners, businesses, and also farmers, individuals. I think everyone has a role to play. But in my view, I think it is doable, and countries are now really discussing the issue. You know how long it took to get to the Paris Agreement, and we are in the middle of this drought discussion where it is coming up. Countries are changing their positions, where they are trying to understand each other, and there is a lot of hope that we will come up with a good solution by 2024 in Saudi Arabia. So I didn't think, especially for you as a young person, there is a lot of things that you can look into, and things will change.
So you think a green economy,
Yes.
like the one we have now, like our economy, the global free market is focused on growth.
Yeah.
And so you think we can still have that and have it be green?
There's
Green
no
recovery,
growth.
I would.
Yeah, that's my point, but do you
doesn't
think?
Yes. Well, you don't have to cut growth so that, necessarily there is some kind of a reduction of growth, but I don't think to the extent that we are thinking, because, the technology is there, and we need to really have the reason of hope because of the young generation. There is a change, but the change is coming slowly but surely, and we need to really support this
Is it
young
possible
generation.
to come by train to Saudi Arabia?
Well, not necessarily, but you can minimize. You don't have to go to Saudi Arabia. This virtual technology, you don't have to. You can travel less. I think there is a lot that can be done.
But the people are suffering now, and how I always think about the people who were majorly traumatized or even died in the crisis, and would you tell them, yeah, change takes time? I couldn't do that. I couldn't look them in the face and say to them, yes, we need the time, so you have to suffer. I couldn't do that. And I'm not saying you can. I really understand your point, and I see the point, and actually you're actually giving me some hope. And that's an achievement. So I'm not one to quickly hope for things.
Julian,
but you also
do we want to open to the audience, because I think we also had that in mind.
Or help us to answer the question.
there's a question.
My comment comes on the nature side, because that's what I work on mostly. And to say that we have come a long way from where we used to look at nature for itself, and now we're at an advanced iteration where we're saying nature and people both have to survive. And I think we have made the point somewhere. And in it, I know you coming across the word now, nature-based solutions. I always ask myself, why do we say nature-based solutions? Nature has always been the solution, not a solution. So we need to really focus back to this point where we improve our ecosystems to survive in that sense. So, this is the one point I would love to make, but really nice listening to the conversations.
My name is Anya. I work with the German Committee for Disaster Reduction, and I would like to hear recommendations from you for the political level, let's say maybe local, national, global, on these crises for a better implementation for the change we are all wanting. How can solutions that we know better be implemented? Because I think the knowledge is here. Where we're lacking is the implementation part. And from your like experience, what would you say? How can we do that better?
Yeah, maybe I have a short answer to that, because when we say we have solutions, these solutions are actually given or provided by a very less diverse part of our community. I think even increasing or having nature, looking at nature, we see that diverse systems are even more stable. And I'm convinced that when we have diverse researchers, when we increase the diversity also in the people that provide the solutions, that develop the solutions, and that implement the solution, that this is one key for our increasing number of solutions in the future even. So that we have not one solution to which fixes everything. This is a process. We always have to develop more solutions for that.
So you're referring to participatory processes involving like all stakeholders concerned, so that they take ownership and also kind of.
I'm talking about the research community. Yeah. For example, we have mostly men, white men. This is the problem. Or I don't know if this is one of the problems. And I'm convinced if we change this, for example, then we have also a greater diversity of solutions that we can implement, for example. But this is not the only.
Are you talking about how to convince the policymakers to actually do something?
Yeah, it's part of the solution.
Yeah, probably.
I was about to come to that, because I think we know the solution. For example, I think it is there. It's about upscaling it, outscaling it. And first of all, I think we need to allow countries to learn from each other. If I were to give the example of the US and Australia, how they mitigate the impacts of drought, and I go and present it in Somalia, I think they will not be motivated, because they know, okay, they have the technology, they know what they are doing. But if I would give them a small scale example from Ethiopia, I think they would be more inspired to do just right next door. So I think first of all, this South-South exchange of experience and learning is very important, simply because you are inspired by your peers. The other thing is for politicians to sensitize them. We always wanted to, we are now working with the GIZ and also the European Commission on the economics of drought preparedness. It's not only that you are avoiding a disaster or lives or livelihoods, but it's also economic sense. 10 to 1, up to 10 to 1 cost ratio, also investing on drought resilience. So I think if we have this kind of narrative, we can really come up with a solution. The other one is this silo approach that you were talking about. You go to Ethiopia, it's in one livestock ministry, in one shelf, just a drought policy. They don't care, no one cares about it. When drought strikes, it's a national issue. Everyone is affected, health is affected, water is affected, environment is affected, everything. So why don't you make it a national issue before it strikes? This is a proactive approach. So I think this kind of discussion should be there, and also trying to also increase the capacity building. When we were in Ethiopia, for example, in Addis Ababa, where they were able to predict the droughts when they are related to El Nino, they are easily predictable, and they knew it's happening before about 6 months, but they did not do anything. They don't have even a computer. They anything that you cannot measure, you cannot manage. So data, trying to really uplifting them, increasing their awareness so that they don't depend on the central government to issue this drought outlook. So increasing capacity at the local level is also very, very important, I think. So there is a lot that should be done. But once we have this activism where everyone knows that it's not drought is a disaster, but it's a natural hazard, but it's not a disaster. From early warning to early action, we know what to do, but what is going to happen, but what can we do? So there is a lot that can be done. The reason for hope is that everybody is taking this issue serious. It was never serious. I work on drought issues for the last 10 years now. We have a very big global conference coming up in April next year, and it's going to be another game changer. Before 10 years, we had a big conference on how to become proactive to drought management. Since then, more than 100 countries have now this policy. Now they are going into implementation. So there is a lot that is going to be done, and it's being done, but it is slow. But I think it's coming. That's how I would say.
So your approach is more local exchanges?
That's one approach.
I'm also really a fan of that, because I think if you have like a government telling small villages what to do, it doesn't work, because they live far from the reality of people in the lower areas. Like I'm from a village of 200 people, and the same solution isn't going to work for Bonn than for where I come from.
Exactly.
And I also love your approach, like diversity. Obviously, I like that approach because I think that's also the system that ruined us on the planet has been made mostly by white men. So I think it's time for not white men to present better solutions to what we're doing. So thank you for the question.
We humans, we are actually also part of nature, so we can't deny that. And I wonder if we can find other solutions that are further away from rational thinking if we try to reconnect more again, feel the connection that we are also part of all that. Maybe we can naturally evolve some solutions.
That's a very good point. I think that's also what we try to do with the storytelling, to evoke emotions, to make people connect with the story or with the topic, or in the case of nature. Obviously, there's also a lot of research on that, how the mental health, for instance, improves when you spend time in nature, and or when you like spend time in the forest, or when you swim in a lake, or when you listen to the sound of the birds. I mean, like real sound research that is saying that. So I think very often people are definitely disconnected. Their life is disconnected from nature, and I like the idea to have these more positive and also emotional approaches, because people are sick of facts in a way. I think many people are just sick of facts, and the facts are frustrating, and they're like, I mean, that's what we like. That's also like to listen to you. I don't really believe it, but I like the hope you're kind of creating inside of me. So this kind of idea to make people reconnect with nature, I think is a good approach. But I mean, how to do that in practice is a different thing. Of course, we can all start with our kids or friends, or so it can become a global movement. And that's maybe also something for you guys to, maybe it's an idea to integrate that into the narrative, kind of.
Yeah, I'm like really from the countryside,
Yeah.
and there's real nature around
Yeah.
here, and not even, I mean, there is realer nature than a small village in Germany, but I like that because it connects to what I said in the beginning. Like the Botanical Garden is something recreated to look at nature, but in a way to look at it apart from it. But we need to be a part of it again. It's important, but we really forget that because this is a big city and cities are growing. It's difficult, but I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So that's why I like to be a researcher. I work with roots and I crawl on the soil.
You put your hands in the soil, it's great.
Connect with your own
Yeah,
roots.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you think that the disconnect between nature and our day-to-day activities or lives is affecting us the way we act on drought? Because I mean, on nature, for example, or do you see the majority of the activists with you are more from the village?
I think there's actually too little people from villages. I
See,
think
so
it's a big thing in
awareness.
Cities, but like when I was in school, we had to form our own part of the movement. There was none we could connect to because there was nothing in the area, like 2 to 3 hours, not a single group that was active in the region, so we had to do that ourselves. But I found that there are people, and the first major protest I organized with a few friends, there were a lot more people than we expected. It was like a really small city, but I think if we could communicate to like the village people that the city is not the enemy, that we're all the same species living in the same nature, and we need a holistic approach. Like we all want the same thing. We all want a good life for ourselves and for our family and for like the people we love. Everyone, I think every human wants that.
And we need more champions, influential people talking about nature. I have kids, teenagers, who don't obviously listen to my advice, but when it comes to the influential people, the actors talking about climate or what you are saying, I think they would influence more, they will have more impact. So I think getting there is also one of the things that we need to really work on beyond the activism. Also
Yeah.
the activists, you should really bring on these influential people. And then people will not be annoyed.
I work a lot with students, and I have the feeling that the next generation is really great. They are really have a good understanding of nature and how
Well,
to
they are
protect.
feeling it, so.
Yeah, maybe. I have really hope in that.
We also have books.
Yeah.
My favorite
Your
part,
favorite
of,
part.
of the thing. We have every single one of us has like brought a book we would recommend that kind of influenced us in a way or is important to us. So we would like to recommend something to you. Who wants to go first?
I can go first. It's called Bark Skins. Yes, Bark Skins by Annie Proulx, and it's about forests, about colonization actually, about two guys from France who go to the French part of Canada, to Quebec, and they try to build a life there in the 18th century, and they work with the forest there, and it's very much about exploitation. It's about how the native people used to connect to the forest and how the immigrants actually destroyed that connection, but it's also full of hope. It's about, like, it's going through several generations, like arriving in the end in the current, and it's also about sustainability and about how to create a more sustainable life. And it's a story, so it's kind of, it's not a book about things, it's a narrative. That's of course why I like it. And it's very brutal, it's very cruel, but it's also, as I said, full of hope.
That sounds absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, I can continue with my book. I have the old book, Böden der Welt. This is translated recently and published last year, Soils of the World. And it accompanied me actually more than 20 years. And it's really a great inspiration because it nicely illustrates the diversity of soils we have on our planet. It presents and has also nice pictures or illustrations. I can show you, for example, this is my favorite soil, the pot soil, because it develops in the boreal zone. It's really colorful and has a huge organic layer on top. So at least it shows the very diversity we have on Earth and the soil forming processes, but also the challenges each of these soils experience due to land use and what happens if we change the land use, for example, for this specific soil. And what I actually like most about this book is that we have different taxonomies to give soils name around the globe. And from my knowledge, this is the first book that tried to find a language to connect the different taxonomies, the German with the international one. And I don't know any other book, so I think it really fits well to finding a way to translate knowledge into another group.
One is the Global Land Outlook. This is our flagship publication. It is a second edition. We had one also in 2017. This was published in 2022. And what we discussed today in terms of what countries are doing to come up with this land restoration agenda, the global resilience, desertification, the problems that they have, and what are the solutions, especially the best practices. What I say about champion countries at small scale, what they are doing. If one would read this, I think you have all the reason for hope that there is a lot of options to really tackle this issue of drought and land degradation. The other one is this drought challenge policy options for developing countries. This was targeted for developing countries, especially because we believe drought does not discriminate, but the impacts of drought do discriminate. And the impacts are hugely felt by developing countries. So we have come up with this book to come up with the policy options. What are the options? So if one would read it, and they would also get to see, like, insurance, for example, a premium insurance. What I like most about this is a chapter that I wrote on subsidized premium insurance, where you can support countries to rehabilitate their land, and then they can also be part of an insurance because they cannot afford to pay a premium. You would pay that, and then they would ask them to also rehabilitate their land. So it's a kind of a win-win approach where there is a culture of being prepared for drought. You can also grow more crops. And it really worked in southern India, for example, and a few other countries. I would recommend this one and the Global Land Outlook. We have the summary for decision makers. Two, yeah.
Yeah, I also have a book.
Oh.
And this one is a bit obvious because it's called "This Is Not a Drill," and its subtitle is "An Extinction Rebellion Handbook." It's basically 2 parts. The first part is tell the truth, like it gives an overview about everything regarding climate change and biodiversity crisis. And it's really short. It's a lot of short essays by a lot of different people from all over the world, different perspectives. It's activists, researchers, but also farmers and people who have nothing to do with any of the academic things or policy things, but just live their lives out, but are affected. And the first part is really depressing. So if you read that, you think there's no hope. But the second part is Act Now. It's about what we can do. It's all the different possibilities we have. It's a new outlook and how we can change society for us to live in better, but also what policies can change. And it shows you that there actually is reason for hope. So I think that really connects with the different perspectives we had, like a more pessimistic outlook that I can also really relate to, but also the optimistic outlook, because I also do believe people can change.
Yeah,
and
I believe that too.
Yeah, I believe people can change, and we know how we can do it. There are strategies developed by a lot of good people like yourselves, and I really think there is reason for hope. And with that, I would like to thank you all for giving your valuable time to us, and also the audience for the interesting comments and questions. And yeah, round of applause for everyone.